Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Aditya. Today I will be conducting the video lecture on epidemiology and biostatistics. Before we start, I'd like to give a few disclaimers. The first thing is that this video lecture is not a substitute for reading the module. It is just going to be a primer to discuss some basic concepts and some basic terms in epidemiology and biostatistics. But the basic assurance that this video lecture will provide is that if you are able to read the modules after seeing this lecture, you will definitely have a better understanding of the subject. But this is definitely not a substitute for reading the module. Let's start with epidemiology first, and we'll start with the definition of epidemiology. It is defined as the study of disease frequency, disease distribution, and disease determinants in a population, and the applications of the results of the study to improve health. This is the basic definition of epidemiology, but let us try to understand what this definition means. First, we look at the study of disease frequency. By this, the basic meaning is that the burden of the disease in the population is first what is studied, to let us know about how many people are affected by this or how many people are dying because of the particular disease or the health event. Second is disease distribution. Here we are primarily concerned about three things: how the disease is distributed in time, how the disease is distributed in place, and how the disease is distributed in person. Meaning to say, which part of the year is this disease more prevalent, which place or which state or which district is this particular disease more prevalent, and about who. Is this affecting young people, old people, men or women, particular occupational group? So this is what we mean by which person is affected. So when you talk about disease distribution, we are primarily concerned about when, where, and who are being affected. Coming to disease determinants, we are primarily interested in understanding what the cause of the disease is, or what are the causes, the various risk factors of this particular disease. Once we have a knowledge of the distribution, of the frequency or the burden, and the determinants, we can apply this knowledge to either prevent or cure this disease at the level of the population. So this is, you can say, the basic definition and application of epidemiology. So again, to just recapitulate, in epidemiology, we are basically interested in finding out how many people are being affected, who is being affected, when are they affected, where are they affected, and what is causing the particular disease. So it applies for all disease and health events. It is important to remember that the definition applies not just to diseases or states of ill health, but also states of positive health. For example, when we say pregnancy is not a disease, but it is something that we as public health people or epidemiologists study because we are interested to see it as an important health event. So epidemiology applies not just to disease, but also states of positive health. Secondly, we try to address gaps in knowledge on all these aspects. And then we apply what we gain to improve public health. Epidemiology basically provides principles and methods to answer questions. But it is important that clinicians and public health people ask the questions. Only then can we apply epidemiological methods and principles. So the uses of epidemiology we can summarize in 6 points. First is to identify the cause of disease and the risk factors of the disease. Second is to determine the extent of the disease in the community. Third is to study the history and the course of each individual disease, about how the disease evolves in a particular individual or in a population. Fourth is to compare different methods of treating the disease or preventing the disease. So we might have options to treat and prevent the disease, but we might not know which one is better. So that is when we have to use some of these methods to assess which is better. And the last one is to provide the basis for development of health policy. So once we have generated evidence which shows that one method is better than the other, then health policy planners can select that particular method to apply to a population level to help prevent or treat the disease at a population level. So this is very important even from a population perspective. Before we move on to discussing epidemiology, let us first just recapitulate about health and disease, which is something you're already familiar with, but we'll just discuss it very briefly. So it's very difficult to just look at a person and say a person is healthy or a person is ill. It so happens that each of us may not be in a perfect state of health, and that we might be on what we call a health disease continuum or a health spectrum. As a part of this health spectrum, they have defined various stages. It ranges from positive health, better health, and freedom from sickness to unrecognized sickness, mild sickness, severe sickness, and death. So at the two extremes, we have positive health and death. And all of us lie somewhere in between in this particular spectrum. For instance, even if an individual has a physical or mental perception of health, it might be possible that several disease processes are already started in this person's body. For instance, we know from evidence that the basic, you can say, initiation of changes that happen due to atherosclerosis starts occurring from a very young age in an individual, but the manifestations take place at a much later stage in life. About each individual disease, we as epidemiologists or as clinicians are interested to find out about the natural history of that particular disease. Meaning to say, we are interested to see how the disease evolves within the individual from start to finish. The stages of natural history of disease are first preclinical stage, where there are some micro level or molecular level alterations that are occurring within the body, at which stage the individual may not actually know about these processes taking place. Soon after that, it might be possible that the person is entering a stage of subclinical illness, where actually some pathological changes are occurring within the body. But we call this subclinical because they have not yet manifested the disease. From this subclinical stage, some individuals will actually progress to the clinical stage of illness. The clinical stage is one in which the individual actually feels the disease. They actually feel ill and they complain of certain health problems such as fever or cough or other kind of complaints. And it is at this stage that usually people come to the physician or the doctor to tell that they have some health problems. From clinical stage, when they get treatment, many individuals may actually recover, but there will be some individuals that will actually face some complications of the illness. This is the stage of complications. And at this stage also doctors will intervene and try to give medicines or perform surgeries to control those complications. And at that stage, one of the two things will happen. Either the patient will recover, or it's possible that in some instances the patient might die. So this is the whole flowchart of the natural history of a particular disease. But as you can see, there are many individuals who might face the risks for these diseases. But the number of people who get the disease may be few, and the number of people who actually die might be very less. This is the natural history of a particular disease. So the importance of understanding the natural history of a disease is that it gives public health people and clinicians the opportunity to intervene at various levels, preferably at earlier levels to reduce the complications and the burden of illness. But if it comes at a later stage, also it will help us make some kind of an intervention so that we can save the lives of the patients. This is the importance of studying the natural history of a disease. Moving on from that, we have an important concept in epidemiology which helps us understand about disease causation or disease determinants, about which we have already talked about when we discussed the definition of epidemiology. So disease determinants, when we talk about this particular concept called epidemiological triad, helps us understand the determinants of a disease. When we say triad, there are three components that are involved. One is the disease agent, second is the host, or the person who is going to suffer the disease. And third is the environment, or it is the surroundings in which the host and the agent exist. So we see that it is the agent related factors, the host related factors, and the environmental related factors coming together that actually leads to the cause of a particular disease. Let us see this in a little more detail. First, we will look at the agent, or the attributes of the agent about which we need to be concerned about. So for a disease, there might be a single agent, or it might be many different agents and risk factors that cause the particular disease. When we talk about biological agents, we are primarily talking about bacteria, virus, protozoans, and other organisms which have the capacity to cause disease. There might be agents which are physical. For example, heat, cold, light, sound themselves can cause diseases. So they are physical agents. Agents might also be chemical, such as heavy metals like lead and mercury, which can cause disease, or acid, which can be thrown at an individual and cause some kind of disabilities. Mechanical agents include those objects and instruments which can cause accidents and injuries. Similarly, other agents might include the absence of genetic related material in the body. For example, there are some diseases which are caused by absence or presence of extra chromosomes. So that is also a disease agent. Sometimes, like bad dietary practices, eating a lot of fat or a lot of carbohydrates can lead to disease. So in that particular instance, it is the nutritional agents which are the agents of the disease. And agents might also be social. So the scope of epidemiology is now extending to social epidemiology. So one of the agents of disease is social. For instance, drugs, alcohol, or smoking might be social agents. But what we see is that it is not adequate that if an agent is present, that everybody around will get the particular illness. So obviously there are some factors about the individual that will also contribute to the development of the illness within the individual. So these are called host factors, or the characteristics of the individual which make them predisposed to a particular disease. These can be classified as demographic features of the individual. The age, the sex, the ethnicity of the individual might make them prone to a particular illness. For instance, young people are more susceptible to cold weather. Very old people might also be susceptible to certain kinds of cancers. Next is biological features of the individual. These can be related to the immunity of the individual and the genetic factors of the individual. For instance, they have shown that some kind of genetic, you can say, genes actually increases the chance of the individual getting diabetes. Third comes the socio-economic factors of the individual. For instance, educational level and marital status might lead to the individual being more susceptible to certain kinds of diseases. And finally, the behavioral factors of the individual. For instance, the person's personality, living habits, such as we can talk about hand washing practices of the individual, might make them more or less prone to certain kinds of diseases. Addictions also come under behavioral features of the individual. So these aspects of the host, the demographic, the biological, socioeconomic, and behavioral, also contribute to the person's predisposition to getting a particular disease. The coming together of the agent and host is facilitated by our third component of the triad, which is the environmental factors. It is the conducive environment that actually facilitates the interaction between the agent and the host. While looking at environmental factors, we can divide it as physical or non-living components of the environment. For example, we can talk about housing. When we talk about housing, we talk about crowding, we talk about ventilation, and these aspects which actually influence the occurrence of many diseases. The water, the air, and the climate, the local climate in the area. Then we go on to biological aspects of the environment. These can be related to the vectors and the reservoirs of the disease in the immediate surrounding. And it is these vectors and reservoirs that actually carry the disease from one individual to another. Next part of the environment is the psychosocial environment. This is related to the cultural values, the customs and the beliefs existing either in that household or in that community, which might make the community or the individual more predisposed to the particular disease. So therefore, when we talk about epidemiological triad, what we realize is that it is the coming together of the appropriate agent, host and environmental features and characteristics that actually leads to the causation of a particular disease. We will go on to an example of epidemiological triad to understand this. We will take tuberculosis as an example. So when you talk about tuberculosis, the agent is actually a bacterium, which is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. What is interesting to know about the agent or the agent factors is that it is transmitted primarily by infective sputum from a person who is already having this disease. The sputum, once it is in the environment, even if it is landed on the ground somewhere, it is possible for this particular organism to survive in that for some period of time. Once it enters the body, it has the capacity to infect the lung, the intestines and several other organs and cause tuberculosis in that particular organ. And it is also interesting to note that there are some strains of tuberculosis which have now become resistant to many types of antibiotics. And this is very important from a clinician's and a public health perspective. About tuberculosis, it is also interesting to know about which kind of people are more susceptible to tuberculosis. We see that malnutrition is one of the key, you can say, risk factors that makes a person predisposed to tuberculosis. Also, immunosuppression, which can happen due to diseases such as HIV and AIDS, can make the person more susceptible to tuberculosis. And it is also seen that those who are working in occupations such as stone cutting and in mining, because they are exposed to dust, that makes their lungs defenses weak and they are also more susceptible to tuberculosis. Talking about environmental factors related to tuberculosis, we see that tuberculosis spreads more easily in areas in which crowding is there. So for example, slums or in poor communities where a lot of people are living within a small space, that facilitates the spread of tuberculosis. We'll move on to the next topic, where we are trying to talk about how many people are affected, or the disease burden, or what we have initially spoken in the definition as disease frequency. So how many? We can talk about A, how many people are affected by the disease, or B, how many people have died. These are called mortality and morbidity indicators. Mortality meaning death, morbidity meaning disease. Basically, these two kinds of indicators help us understand about the burden of the particular disease or the burden of ill health in a population. They also help us test the effectiveness of some of our interventions. So if the mortality rate reduces after an intervention, that gives us an idea that the intervention might be helpful. Some examples of mortality indicators are mortality rates. They are expressed as mortality rates. I have given 3 examples here. The first example is crude death rate. It just means the total number of deaths that are occurring per 1,000 population in a particular area in a particular year. Infant mortality rate is a little more specific. It is looking at the number of infants defined as those who are less than 1 year of age. Is the number of infant deaths that are occurring per 1,000 live births in that particular population in that particular year. Third is case fatality rate. How many people are dying because of a particular disease for every 1,000 persons who are suffering from that particular disease. So this is case fatality rate. The reason these are called rates is because we are trying to measure the deaths against a population that might be affected by that problem against the amount of time that these diseases are occurring in. For instance, we will look at death rates occurring for a particular year. So because it is time bound, we are using the particular phrase which is rate, and they are called mortality rates. Next is morbidity rates. There are two types of measures that will be very useful for you to familiarize with. One is called incidence and the next is called prevalence. So incidence is basically the number of new cases that are occurring in a particular population that is susceptible to a disease in a given period of time. Whereas prevalence is the total number of cases of a particular disease in a population at that point in time. This might include both old cases and new cases, but all of those who are currently suffering from the disease. I have just given two examples here to illustrate the formulae for one mortality rate and one morbidity rate. So I have taken the example of case fatality rate here. I have expressed the numerator as total number of deaths due to a particular disease into 1000 divided by total number of cases for the same disease. And once this is calculated, we express the figure as the number of deaths due to X disease per 1000 cases of X disease. That is case fatality rate. Second, I have illustrated the formula for prevalence. This is the total number of current cases, which is the old and new cases of a particular disease at that point in time into 100 divided by the estimated population at that point in time. So this will be expressed as the number of cases of X disease per 100 population at that point in time, or simply a prevalence of n percentage in this population at this point in time. So each of these measures of mortality and morbidity have such formulae, and when you have the relevant data, it is possible for you to calculate these mortality and morbidity rates. Let us just familiarize ourselves with a few epidemiological terms before we actually discuss the actual research process which is undertaken. These terms will actually help us in technically expressing what we are trying to do in this particular research study. First is the term hazard. So hazard is an entity or a substance that has the capacity to cause harm. It can be damaging to health. Such a substance or such an entity is called a hazard. Intervention means an activity that is done purposefully to influence a health outcome, such as when we are treating a patient, we are doing an intervention. When we are giving a vaccine, we are doing an intervention. When we are giving a bed net to a person to use, we are doing an intervention. So when something is done, a purposeful activity is done, that is called an intervention. Third term is exposure. Exposure means an interaction between a hazard or an intervention with the individual. So for example, if a person is going out in the sun, we will say the person is getting exposed to the sunlight. If a person is smoking cigarette, we will say the person is getting exposed to the cigarette smoke. And a person who is not taking cigarette, we will call that person as unexposed. So a person who is exposed is the one who is facing the hazard, and the person who is unexposed is not facing the hazard. The next term is outcome, or more specifically we can call it as health outcome. It is the state of health that the scientist is interested to observe in the particular research study. So for example, if we are measuring weight in this particular study on malnutrition, so the outcome here is weight, which will be expressed in kgs or in grams. Final term here is population of interest, which is that section of the population which is of concern to our particular study. So for example, if we are talking about infant deaths, then our population of interest is the infant population in this particular area. If you are talking about maternal mortality or maternal morbidity, we are primarily looking at the mothers or the reproductive age group women in this particular area. So that is basically defines the population of interest for our particular study. Now we come to the first stage of a research process, which is framing a question of framing a research question, or we can say framing an epidemiological question. The important thing here is, what is it that the researcher wants to know? That basically helps frame the research question. There are some small guidelines here which helps us frame a good epidemiological question. It is abbreviated as PICO or PICO. P stands for population of interest, I stands for intervention or exposure, C stands for control, and O stands for outcome. Let us take an example here and see how this is all coming into the form of a question. Let us take an example to understand how a good epidemiological research question can be framed. So the question here reads, will the use of bed nets reduce the incidence of malaria cases as compared to those who don't use bed nets amongst tribal populations in India? So there are many parts to this question. One is those who are using bed nets among tribal population. So here the tribal population becomes our population of interest. The use of bed nets becomes our intervention, which is what we are trying to do. We are trying to compare the number of malaria cases that is occurring in those who are using the bed nets and those who are not using the bed nets. So those who are not using the bed nets becomes our comparison or control group. And finally, we are trying to measure incidence of malaria cases in each of these groups. So the incidence of malaria cases becomes our health outcome of interest. So when I talk about PICO, population, intervention, control and outcome, this question actually has all that information. And when all this information is available, it helps us frame a good design, a good research design for answering this question. There is one more example here. Does the exposure to cold increase the risk of neonatal mortality as compared to neonates who are not exposed to cold? So here our population of interest is neonates, meaning those babies which are less than 1 month old. We are interested to know about whether the mortality, the neonatal mortality risk is increasing. So the health outcome of interest is neonatal mortality. The intervention or exposure, in this case it is exposure that we are interested in, is the exposure to cold. And we are comparing neonates, those who are not exposed to cold. So that becomes our control or comparison group. So again, this question is giving us many of the details that are essential. Of course, in many instances, epidemiological questions need not have all these details. There are many instances where we might not need a comparison group. And those kinds of questions are simpler to ask and simpler to address. For instance, we might be interested to know what are the demographic features of maternal death cases in a particular village. So here we are only interested to know what are the demographic features of all the maternal death cases in a particular village. We are not trying to compare anything, we just want to know about the features of all the cases which have died. Is there an association between drinking water and diarrhea? So we are just trying to see in a population how many people who are drinking particular sources of water are getting diarrhea. So again, we are not trying to compare, we are just trying to survey the population. Or third, what is the disease profile of OPD cases in a particular hospital? So here we are just trying to document each and every case that comes in and what kind of disease that person is suffering. So at the end of the day, we will get information such as so many people are coming, 10% is coming with cough, 20% coming with diarrhea. So it just gives us, you can say, an overall picture of the cases that are coming to the hospital. So here also we are not trying to make any comparisons. These kinds of questions are more simpler forms of epidemiological questions. We will get into more details about what each of them actually mean. One important thing to do while planning an epidemiological study is to make a case definition. For example, previously I have spoken about neonatal deaths, maternal deaths. So in that particular instance, we see that the case is a case of maternal death or a case of infant death. We can qualify further. If you're talking about specifically in some situations, maybe talking about male people. If you're talking about malnourished cases, we might say those whose weight is less than X amount of weight. So we can make it more and more specific. So this case definition again will depend on what the study question is, and we have to have some specific parameters, or you can say a specific observable, measurable parameters by which we can define the particular case. One more term that is useful to understand before moving on to planning the study design is what is variable. What is a variable? So variables are measurable entities which help define a particular case. For instance, if I am looking at a research question which is what are the demographic and reproductive characteristics of maternal death cases in village X, the list of variables for answering this particular question will be: 1. Each woman whom we will be documenting will be given a case number. So the first variable will be the case number. Second, we will be interested to know the age of the women, because the question says we are interested to know the demographic and reproductive characteristics. So 1, we will document the age of the woman. Then we will document the socioeconomic status of the women, the caste, the marital status, the number of children the woman has had, and the number of months of pregnancy at which the woman has died. So these are all the variables that we will be using to answer the question, the demographic and reproductive characteristics of maternal death cases in X village. So now that many of these epidemiological terms are clear, and now that we are familiar with how to ask epidemiological questions or a research question, we will move on to getting familiarized with what are the various study designs that are available that will help us answer our research question. Study designs in epidemiology are broadly classified into observational studies and experimental studies. Experimental studies are distinguished because they involve a particular intervention. So in any study where the researcher or one of the research associates are going to make a particular intervention, that they are purposefully going to make an intervention in the population and trying to study the effect of this particular intervention, those kinds of studies are called experimental studies. In observational studies, the researchers are only going to observe and they are not going to make a purposeful intervention to see a particular change. Let us look at first observational studies in more detail. They are also classified, the observational studies are classified into two categories: descriptive studies and analytical studies. In descriptive studies, we are only trying to describe a particular kind of health problem in the community. For instance, the question that we saw earlier, what are the demographic features of maternal death cases in X village, is a descriptive study because we are trying to describe each of the cases which have died. In analytical observational studies, we are still making a comparison between two groups. We are not making an intervention, but we are making a comparison between two groups. The first example stated here is cross-sectional study. So this is the simplest form of observational study where we will actually conduct a survey in a population and ask questions of both exposure and outcome. So for instance, we can ask a person, what is your source of drinking water and have you suffered from diarrhea in the past 1 month? This we will ask everybody, and at the end of it we will have individual level data of how many people have used what source of drinking water, and out of them how many have suffered from diarrhea. So there we can make a comparison of exposure and outcome, or different kinds of exposure and the same outcome. Some may have drank well water and some of them may have had diarrhea. Some of them may have had drinking water supply from the municipal corporation and very few of them may have diarrhea. So there we can automatically within the survey population compare these two groups. Next is case control studies, where we select cases, that means already those who are suffering from a particular disease, and compare them with controls, those who are not suffering from that particular disease. and we will measure or we will compare what is the situation of exposure of a particular hazard in the control group and what is the situation of exposure in the case group. So this is a comparison between cases and controls, and this is called case control study. The third design is called cohort study. In this study, we are following two groups of individuals. One group of individual which is exposed to a particular risk factor. For instance, smokers. They have not yet developed any disease, but they are all smoking. So they will form our exposure group. And the second group is a group of non-smokers, those who are not smoking. We will follow both these groups in time, and we will learn about specific kind of health problems being suffered by smokers and non-smokers, and we can compare both these two groups. Moving on to experimental studies. This is the second kind of epidemiological studies where the researcher is actually making an intervention. So for example, we can say, does giving a particular medicine improve the chance of survival of a particular patient as compared to doing the previous kind of treatment which the doctor may have been doing? This is testing a new medicine. Or we can say, is the use of bed nets reducing the incidence of malaria in a particular population? The intervention here is giving the bed nets or giving the health education about the bed nets. So in each of these cases, we are trying to make an intervention. Again, when we talk about experimental, there are two types of studies that can come under it. One is called randomized control trial, in which a population of individuals is randomized into the experiment group or the intervention group and the control group. And the intervention is given only to the intervention group, and the results are compared with the control group afterwards. The other type of experimental study is called quasi-experiment, where the groups of individuals are not randomized. One group of individuals is given the intervention, the other group is kept as a control, but this group is not selected from a common pool of population which is randomized into both these groups. We will look at each of these in slightly more detail. Here, we are primarily trying to discuss what is the use and what are the main issues with each of these study designs. Let us look at the merits and the issues with each kind of study design. It is important to understand that it is not necessary that one study design is better than the other study design. It is just that for your research question, one design is more appropriate than the other design. It depends at the end of the day on your question. First, cross-sectional studies. We see that these kinds of studies are useful in finding associations and finding prevalences. For instance, if we want to know what is the burden of TB in a particular population, we can conduct a cross-sectional study, and at the end of the survey, we can find out that this population has got this much prevalence of tuberculosis. They are also useful in finding associations, like what I had mentioned about drinking water and diarrhea. We can see at the end of the survey, we might be able to find out that those who are drinking water from a well source might be having higher cases of diarrhea, more number of cases of diarrhea than those who are using municipal tap water. So here we have just administered a survey in a population, and we have found that there is an association between drinking well water and having a higher risk for diarrhea. The resource that is needed for cross-sectional study, of course, is a survey tool, and with the help of research assistants, they can administer the survey tool in a particular population and get the data. After collecting the data, we can calculate prevalence rate, a prevalence ratio, and odds ratio. Details of this you can of course follow up and read in the module. It is beyond the scope of this video lecture. One of the problems with cross-sectional study is response rate. It can happen that those who are conducting the survey will go to the population to find out the information, but many people might refuse to give them information. They might say, we don't want to answer your questionnaire. And that creates a certain kind of bias in the collection of data, and it might be possible that those who are refusing to answer this questionnaire are having a different kind of characteristic than those who are answering the questionnaire. Because of this, the results that we get from our survey may not be truly representative of what is happening in the population. So the bias here is one of selection bias, about which we will discuss in a later slide, and this is occurring primarily due to response rate for surveys is usually low. The second kind of study which we had discussed is case control study. This kind of study, as I told you, we start with those who are already having the disease. So this kind of study design is useful for studying diseases which are rare. So if you know that we are trying to study a disease and what is causing this particular disease, if the disease is rare, we can start with those individuals who are already having the disease. So we don't have to go searching in the population about who's having the disease. So we start with a group of individuals who are having the disease, who are coming to the hospital, and compare them with a group of individuals who are not having the disease. So for example, if we were looking at the case of lung cancer and smoking, we can first start with those who are having lung cancer. You can say select 20 cases of lung cancer. We select 20 cases of those who are not having lung cancer. Then we compare, what we compare is previously how many of these lung cancer patients have been smoking, and we compare those who are not having lung cancer, how many people were smoking. So when we make that comparison, we get what kind of ratio of exposure do these two groups have with each other. And that gives us some idea about the causal association between the exposure and the outcome. So here it is a retrospective study because there are already cases and we are trying to ask them how their behavior has been in the past. So it is a retrospective kind of a study. At the end of a case control study, we can calculate what is called as an odds ratio. So odds ratio means what are the odds of exposure to a particular hazard in the disease group against the odds of exposure in the non-disease group. And when we compare these two odds, it becomes an odds ratio. So for instance, in case of lung cancer and smoking, we can see that the odds of exposure is quite high in lung cancer cases for smoking, and it is quite low for those who are not smoking. So the odds ratio in this particular instance might be more than 1. It is high. If the odds ratio comes as 1, it shows that the exposure to smoking is equal in both groups, which might tell us that smoking might not be related to lung cancer. But the truth of the matter is that we will find in such a situation that the odds ratio is more than 1. Coming to the biases or the issues of case control studies, one is it is always difficult to select the appropriate controls or the comparison group to those who are suffering the disease. Details about this you can read from your text and manual. I will also give you recommend certain reading materials which you can refer to at the end of this video lecture. The second problem with case control studies is because it is retrospective, it relies sometimes on people's memories, and it so happens that people might not remember several details about their exposure and about their illness, and that might actually create some kind of bias in the data that we are collecting. So the results that we are obtaining may not be as accurate as they should be. The third kind of study is cohort study. So this, we said that we are going to follow a group of those who are exposed to a particular hazard and those who are not exposed to a particular hazard. For example, smokers and non-smokers, we will follow them over a long period of time to see what kind of health outcomes are occurring in both these groups. So therefore, cohort study design is useful for rare exposures. So for example, occupational groups are usually followed up through cohort studies. If we feel that this particular occupation is actually leading to a certain kind of health problem, we can decide that, okay, we will follow this particular occupational group over a period of 10 years, and we will note down how many of these people are developing particular kinds of diseases. Simultaneously, we will choose a group, a control group, which is not exposed to those kind of occupational hazards. And we will see how many of these individuals are developing those kinds of diseases. Eventually, we can compare the disease rates in the exposed group and the unexposed group, and that will give us something called a risk ratio. What is the risk of developing the disease if you are exposed to a particular hazard as compared to the risk of the disease if you are not exposed to that particular hazard. For example, if you're talking about smoking and lung cancer, we can say that smoking, among smokers, so many people are getting lung cancer. Let's say, for example, 20% of smokers are developing lung cancer in 20 years. Amongst non-smokers, we find that only 2% of the population is developing lung cancer. So when you take a ratio of this group and this group, it will be 20 divided by 2. And we see that the risk ratio for lung cancer between smokers and non-smokers is 10. So the risk ratio here is 10. And that is a very high risk ratio, as you will learn when you read more number of epidemiological studies. The main problem of cohort studies is called loss to follow-up, meaning to say that because cohort study lasts for long periods of time, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 10 years, sometimes even 20 years, many people might decide to drop out of the study for various reasons. One is they might migrate out from the area, so you might not be able to follow them up. Or voluntarily they feel that they don't want to continue participating in the study and they say we will leave, we don't want to give you any more data. So loss to follow-up is an important issue that leads to data that might not again be truly representative of the processes that are going on. Finally, randomized control trial or intervention studies is suitable or is ideal, we can say, for in any situation where an intervention is taking place. The ideal test for an intervention is a randomized control trial. So here the kind of resources that we need is a research team and a systematic data collection process. And at the end of conducting a randomized control trial, we usually land up with the outcome of a risk ratio or a rate ratio, and we can also calculate something called as attributable risk. We will discuss about these things in the next few slides. The main issue with randomized control trial is that it has to be technically sound. If it is technically sound, the kind of biases and issues that will be there with data collection is usually very minimum. So that's why epidemiologists usually suggest that if you can conduct a randomized control trial for a particular research question, they suggest that you should conduct a randomized control trial and avoid all other research designs because it has least chance for any kind of bias in the data collection. At this juncture, we will try to introduce biostatistics. So biostatistics is a discipline by itself, but basically when we are talking about it in the context of epidemiology, we can say that biostatistics provides certain tools to analyze epidemiological data. Biostatistics is also used for important aspects of research design, such as calculating the sample size for the particular research question. How many people do we need to interview? How many people do we need to survey? How many people should be there in the exposed group and the unexposed group? These kinds of calculations can be helped by biostatistical methods. Once we have collected our data, biostatistical methods can also be used to compare these two groups, the data of risk in one group and the risk in another group, or the odds in one group or the odds in another group, or the proportion in one group and the proportion in the other group, can be compared using biostatistical methods. I have listed a few types of biostatistical tests that are used in making comparisons in epidemiological studies. Firstly, for comparing between proportions, like for instance, we find one group there is 50% people who have got the disease and in another group there is 25% who have got the disease. These are proportions in two different groups, and the test that is used to make a comparison between these proportions is called a Z-test. If we are comparing means, for instance, if we find that the average weight in one group, if the average weight of one group is 25 and the average weight of another group is 28, and we want to compare these two averages, there are methods to do that, and that is called a t-test. If we are trying to find the association between categorical variables, For instance, if we are trying to find, as I had mentioned earlier, if we want to say socioeconomic status is associated with a certain kind of water source, so we make a survey and we see that those who are rich, most of them are using municipal water. Those who are poor, most of them are using well water. Those who are even poorer, they are going longer distances and getting their water mainly from some pond source. If we want to find the association between socioeconomic status and drinking water source, that is the association between categorical variables, we use something called a chi-square test. And finally, what I have mentioned here, the last one, if you are trying to find the relationship between numerical data, for example, if we have age on one side and if we have height on the other side, for each individual we have the person's individual age is this much and his height is this much. So we have numerical data on both sides. This we can do what we call as regression analysis. Based on the kind of distribution in this data, it can either be linear regression, logistical regression, Poisson regression, or there are some other forms of regression also, but that will primarily be related to the kind of data that we are looking at. About data itself, we might be collecting the data ourselves, which is called primary data, and that is related to the question that we have proposed. It might be possible that the question that we have proposed, there is no current data available for that, so we have to actually plan for the collection of the data. It might also be possible that somebody has already collected data which can help us answer our research question. So in that instance, we will use the data which has already been collected if it is appropriate, and that is called secondary data. For instance, you know that routinely data is being collected by the sample, sorry, I'll just start. For instance, you might be familiar with some routine data sources such as the National Family Health Survey, what is called the NFHS. So the most recent one was conducted in 2006. The census, for example, is another routinely collected data which is conducted once in 10 years. And each of these routinely collected data can also be used to answer some kinds of epidemiological questions. The National Family Health Survey, for instance, can give us information about the antenatal care facilities. It gives us information about socioeconomic status, about certain kinds of exposure, about use of family planning services, and these kinds of data can be available from National Family Health Survey. For data collection, it is also useful to look at what is the kind of tool that is being used for data collection. Most usually we use an instrument such as a questionnaire or a format which will need to be filled for each particular case that is being looked at for the particular study. So when we talk about the measuring instrument, which may be the questionnaire or a format or even some kind of a device used for measurement, they have to have the attributes of validity and reliability. Validity means the ability to measure what needs to be measured. So the questionnaire should be suitable enough to collect the relevant data which will help answer your question. That is validity. For instance, if you are going to use a weighing machine to check weight because your main interest in your study is to check the weight, that will be valid. Using a weighing machine is valid in your for your particular study. The next attribute is reliability. It is the ability of the instrument to give the same output even if conducted repeatedly by the researcher on the subject. For instance, every time you ask the same patient to stand on the weighing machine, it has to give the same output. That is called repeatability, which is an attribute of reliability. And secondly, if different researchers are using the same instrument, it might be a questionnaire. If the different researchers are using the same instrument on the same case, they should be able to get the same output. So this constitutes the reliability of the instrument. Here the instrument, as I said, can be a questionnaire, a format, or a device. So if the tool or the instrument is both valid and reliable, then it is acceptable for the particular study. Now that we have asked the research question and we have started thinking about the study design which might be more appropriate for this question, we are at the stage where we might want to state the hypothesis of our study. The hypothesis actually stems from the research question and it should be stated before the research is conducted, because if the hypothesis is not stated before the research is conducted, then our analysis becomes faulty. The reasons for this we will discuss later. So the hypothesis, it is a statement of possibility and it's based on existing knowledge. It originates from the question. For example, if our research question is, does cigarette smoking increase the risk of lung cancer among smokers as compared to non-smokers? Our hypothesis will be, cigarette smoking increases the risk of lung cancer among smokers as compared to non-smokers. That is our hypothesis. And our research and our study is going to help test this hypothesis. When we talk about hypothesis, we have to also be aware of the converse of the hypothesis, which is called the null hypothesis. And biostatistical tests actually test against the null hypothesis. So in this particular situation, the null hypothesis would state there is no difference in risk between the risk of lung cancer between smokers and non-smokers. There is no difference in risk of lung cancer among smokers and non-smokers. This is what is called as the null hypothesis, which is the opposite or the converse of your research hypothesis. And it is this null hypothesis that we will be testing through the research process. The next stage in research will be actually to select your study sample. Firstly, what is a sample? It is basically a part of the population of interest of your research, and it might have characteristics that are similar to the population if you have selected this sample in a random manner, or it might help the researcher because this particular sample has got some specific features or characteristics. So in very simple words, the sample is a part of a larger population of interest. The next important thing is, why are we actually not conducting the research on the entire population but rather just choosing a small sample? There are many reasons for this. Firstly, selecting a sample saves on time, it saves on resources, and it saves on money. Most importantly, if we choose the right sample, it has the ability to give us the true answer to our research question. So it is not even necessary for us to actually survey the whole population to find out the truth about a particular answer, truth about a particular enquiry. It might be possible that if we choose the right sample, we can understand about the truth of the particular health problem in the population by studying the small sample rather than the whole population. As a correctly chosen sample has the ability to tell us about the health situation of the whole population, we are actually not justified to survey the whole population every time we want an answer to a question. We can make do with a sample of the population. And these are the reasons by which and due to which researchers choose a sample of the population to answer their research question. So there are some methods to sample the population, and this again is dependent on the kind of research question that we are trying to answer. There are two types of basic sampling techniques. One is called probabilistic, one is called non-probabilistic. In probabilistic sampling, there is an element of randomness of selection, meaning to say from a whole population, we will be selecting individuals not knowingly, but through a process by which any person has a chance to get selected in your sample. So that kind of a sample is called a random sample. There are many ways by which we can select a random sample. Firstly, in a very simple way, we can decide every fifth house is going to be selected in this particular village for the study. That is called systematic sampling. Second is, we can say we are going to make a list of all the houses, put them in, you can say chits, and out of that we will just select a few. So that is a simple random sample. Or we can actually use a computer program from a list of houses. We can ask the computer program to give us 10 houses at random. So the computer will use a formula and select 10 houses, and that is giving us a random sample. Sometimes, to make our sample more representative of the population, we might do something called a stratified random sample. Meaning to say, if we want enough adequate representation in our sample of the various age groups, we can say we will randomly select 5 people from less than 10 age group. We will randomly select another 5 between 10 and 20 age group. Similarly, we will randomly select 5 between 50 to 60 age group, and so on. So our population is, you can say, representative of all the various age groups. These are some examples of random samples. Non-random or non-probabilistic sampling is usually not used in epidemiological studies. It is used in another class of studies called qualitative studies. About this, I will just give a small introduction at the end of this lecture. There are 2 types of samplings here. One is called convenience sampling, meaning to say the first few people whom you can interview, you will interview those people and you will finish your research study. For instance, if you are going to a clinic and sitting there, and whichever patient is coming that day to the OPD, you ask them the relevant questions. That is called a convenience sample. Purposive sampling is if you are specifically interested to know about a particular subject and you feel that you want to include specific people in that particular study, that becomes a purposive sample. This is also primarily used in qualitative studies. The next thing about sampling is the sample size estimation, meaning to say how many people should we include in our study. For this, again, there are various methods to decide about how many people to include in the study. It will depend mainly on the research question and the kind of health problem that you are studying. There are factors such as the study parameters, the prevalence of the particular disease or health event in this particular population, the size of the impact that you are expecting, meaning to say if you are expecting a large change after making an intervention or due to an exposure. Next we come to sample size estimation, meaning to say how many people do we need to select for our study. Because if the sample size is too small, it might not be truly representative of what is happening in the population. Secondly, usually epidemiologists are concerned about sample size for their studies. Whereas in qualitative research, as you will see later, sample size is not the main, you can say, worrying factor for the researcher. They might be able to do with very small sample sizes, which might be enough to help them answer their research question. But for epidemiological studies, it is very important that the correct sample size is chosen for answering the specific research question. And there are methods by which we can calculate what is the appropriate sample size for this particular study. There are formulae available, and also some of the statistical softwares have inbuilt formulae which can help a person calculate the required sample size if the researcher is able to enter some kind of basic information. For instance, some sample size formulae may ask you some things about the kind of disease. What is the prevalence of disease? Your research question might be looking at tuberculosis. So it might ask you what is the prevalence of tuberculosis in the population. It might ask what kind of change are you expecting after giving this medicine for tuberculosis? What might be the change in prevalence? So some of this information might be asked, and this will help you to calculate what kind of sample size might help answer this particular question. So you can explore some statistical software. You can also explore some articles which are giving you these kind of formulae. And for each kind of study, there are slight variations in the formulae for calculating sample size. So now you have got your sample size, you have your instrument ready, you have your format ready, you carry out the data collection. After that, you have your data, and then you enter the data in a kind of database. You can either choose a very simple software which is available to all, such as Microsoft Excel, or you can choose some kind of statistical software such as SPSS or Stata, or whichever you are using in your organization, and enter all your data in the form of the tables and matrices which are available, and then it is ready for you can say statistical analysis. Some of the things that we usually do to help us make sense of the data that we have collected is: one, measures of central tendency; second is graphical representations and frequency distribution curves; third is making comparisons, as I told earlier, between two groups, intervention and control, or exposed and unexposed groups; and fourth is doing the kind of regression analysis I had spoken about. Let us just explore these briefly one by one. Measures of central tendency is basically implying that we are trying to find in a given data set what is the central value. There are three simple ways in which this can be done. First one is average, which all of you are familiar with. Average is nothing but the total of each individual value divided by the total number of values. So if you, for instance, want to find the, if we have the data of weight of the students in a particular classroom, we'll say, okay, one student is 25 kgs, one student 28, one student 35, another student 20, and so on. For finding the average, we will actually add up all the weights and divide by the total number of students in the class. That will give you the average. Another way to find the central value is something called median. For this, we arranged all the individual weights from smallest to largest. So if you have 30 students in the class, who has got the least weight will be the first one, who's got the maximum weight will be the last one. It is arranged in ascending order. And the median will be the central value, which is the reading that is actually coming in the center. So if it is an odd number, if there are 29 students, the 15th student, whatever the 15th student weight is the median value. But if there are 30 students, the median value is the average between the 15th and the 16th student. So this gives you median. Mode is the third type of measure of central tendency. Here, if you have written all the values that you have collected, whichever value is getting repeated the most number of times is the mode. For instance, while you are checking weight, if you see that most of the students are having a weight of 26 kgs compared to any other weight, you will say that the mode is 26. Each of these values of central tendency has their advantages and disadvantages. For example, average includes all, you can say, the entire sample. Everybody who is being measured, you are including, and you are getting an average which is representative of this whole thing. Median is useful when you have some values that are very different from the other values. For example, it might be possible that there is 30 students in the class. Most of them are having weight between 25 and 35 kgs, but there is one student who is having a weight of 50 kgs. If you take an average in such a situation, automatically the average is higher than actually what it should be. Most of the students are having a low weight, but because one student is 50 kgs or 60 kgs, the whole average is increasing. Whereas in median that will not happen because you're only looking at what is the middle value. So I hope you understood some of the basic aspects of measures of central tendency. There are various situations in which you might want to use an average and you might want to use a median, and that will become clear as in how you collect your data. Some types of data are more suitable to be analyzed from an average perspective. Some data in which you have extremes of values, you might prefer to choose median. Next we will talk about frequency distribution. It might so happen that you have data, but you don't want to analyze the data as individual units. You want to group the data. For example, if you're talking about weight, you might say we will first look at those who are weighing between 20 and 25 kgs, those who are weighing between 25 and 30 kgs, those who are weighing between 35 and 40 kgs, like that. There you will just put how many students are weighing between 20 and 25 kgs. You will find some 5 students. How many students are weighing between 25 and 30 kgs? Maybe there are 8 students. And similarly, so you actually get frequencies of number of students who are having a certain weight category, who are in a certain weight category. Once this distribution is done, we can actually plot it on a graph and have a frequency distribution as is shown in this figure here. So on the x-axis you have the weight categories, and on the y-axis you have the number of individuals who are falling in that particular weight category. Once this is done, you can join the curves, you can join the dots and create the curve, and you have what is called a frequency distribution. And from the frequency distribution, there are many things that we can understand. And this will also help us choose the appropriate kind of data analysis technique. The second image that is shown here is one of cumulative frequency distribution. And the use of this is that it can help us calculate what is the median for this particular case. Cumulative frequency means, as can be seen in the figure here, it is the total number of cases that is falling under that particular group. So in cumulative frequency, we will say what is the total number of individuals falling less than 25, what is the total number of individuals who are falling less than 30 kgs, total individuals less than 35. So at each instance, the graph only increases, because at the end of it, all the individuals in the study will be included in the last and final point. And that is basically given here on the y-axis as the total number of individuals who are participating in the study. So from the cumulative frequency curve, if we choose the midpoint of the total number of cases, and if we drop a perpendicular parallel to the x-axis and it intersects with the curve, at that point in time, if we extend this to the x-axis, we can see that we can get what the median value for this particular frequency distribution is. Next, we will come to hypothesis testing. As I have already said that we state a null hypothesis at the start of our exercise, and our whole research exercise might be actually moving towards testing this null hypothesis. So we have stated the null hypothesis, we have collected our data. Now we are going to analyze the data. For conducting the hypothesis testing, based on the kind of outcome that we are looking at, which might be a proportion, which might be a mean, which might be categorical variables, I have already said that we will be using either the z-test, the t-test, or the chi-square test, or a regression analysis. Each of these tests will be testing the particular null hypothesis. After applying the test, while applying the test, of course, we are using a particular formula. For each of these tests, there is a particular formula. Once we use the particular formula, we land up with a certain figure. In the z-test, we land with something called a z-statistic. In the t-test, we land with something called the t-statistic. In the chi-square test, we land up with something called a chi-square value. In the regression analysis, we land with the regression coefficient. Each of these things is also associated with something called as a p-value or a probability value. Now, the p-value is something that is widely misused and misunderstood amongst those who are attempting to conduct research. It is important that you understand what the p-value is so that you are not landing up in a situation where you are misinterpreting it. So the p-value is actually the result of a statistical test for a particular null hypothesis. So you have a null hypothesis, you are applying a statistical test for that null hypothesis, you are getting a particular p-value as a result, and this p-value has to be assessed against the null hypothesis and not by itself. Without stating a null hypothesis at the start of your analysis, the p-value is of little or no significance at all. What the p-value tells us is it tells us the probability that the null hypothesis is true. Okay? For example, you have conducted a statistical test of comparison and it tells you that the p-value at the end of the statistical test is 0.01. What does that mean? It means that if the null hypothesis is true, the probability of finding the result that you have found is 1 in 100 or 0.01. For example, if we go back to our previous example of smoking and lung cancer, we have stated in our null hypothesis that there is no difference in risk for lung cancer among smokers and non-smokers. There is no difference in risk. That is our null hypothesis. At the end of the study, we have found that there is a risk ratio of lung cancer between smokers and non-smokers is 16. Meaning to say that the risk of lung cancer among smokers is 16 times more than the risk of lung cancer among non-smokers. This is the result we have found. And we have applied this statistical test and we have a result stating that the p-value is 0.001. How we will interpret this is that if the null hypothesis is true, meaning to say our null hypothesis that there is no difference in risk between smokers and non-smokers, if that is true, then the probability of finding the risk ratio of what we have found as 16 is 0.001 or 1 in 1000, meaning to say that it would be very rare that we can find such a result for a null hypothesis of no difference in risk, meaning to say that there is a very good chance that the null hypothesis is not true, meaning to say that there is a difference in risk in lung cancer among smokers and among non-smokers. I hope that has been clear. It might sound that some kind of reverse logic is being used, but if you just read parts of the statement by itself, you might be able to make sense of this. So the p-value is actually helping us find whether the null hypothesis is true or not true, or what is the probability of finding the result that we have found if the null hypothesis is true. So here in this particular case, we have seen that there is a very, very small chance of finding the result that we have found if this null hypothesis is true. And that indirectly gives us the indication that the null hypothesis is not true. So how do we interpret p-values? I have given some guidelines here on how you can interpret p-values. So for a particular hypothesis, if you have found a p-value of more than 0.1, you can say that there is no evidence against the null hypothesis, meaning to say that what you have found from your study is not contradicting the null hypothesis. If the p-value is 0.05, is more than 0.05 but less than 0.1, there might be some suggestive evidence against the null hypothesis. Likewise, if we go and find that our p-value is very small, less than 0.01 or less than 0.001, it actually gives us very strong evidence against the null hypothesis. That is how you will interpret it. You will not use terms such as significant and non-significant. So if something is less than 0.05, there is a common practice of saying that if a p-value of less than 0.05 is got, you state that the statistical difference is significant. It is better to avoid that practice because there is actually no clear-cut reason why we can say if something is less than 0.05, it is a statistically significant result. So a p-value is actually a continuous distribution and we have to interpret the p-value as and how we have calculated it. These are of course some guidelines to help you interpret the p-value. But it is important to remember that the p-value is a continuous distribution and we have to interpret it based on our null hypothesis. Some of the outcomes that we have been discussing so far is risk, attributable risk, relative risk and odds ratio. This is a small summary on what these terms mean. So the risk actually means the number of cases occurring during a given time period or the number of people affected by a particular problem during a given time period divided by the number of disease-free persons at the start of that time period. So meaning to say if you are starting your study with 100 people who are not having a particular problem and at the end of the study time period 10 of them are getting affected, the risk will be 10 divided by 100. So when you talk about relative risk, you are talking about the risk between two groups, such as in the example of smoking and lung cancer, we see the risk for lung cancer among smokers and the risk in lung cancer among non-smokers, and the relative risk is you can say the division between the risk among smokers and the risk among non-smokers. That gives you a relative risk that the smokers have in comparison to the non-smokers. So if the smokers have a risk of 10 people getting lung cancer out of 100, and the non-smokers have a risk of 1 person getting lung cancer out of 100, the relative risk becomes 10 divided by 1, which is 10. Similarly, attributable risk is calculated by the formula risk amongst exposed minus risk among non-exposed. So in this same example, if we see that risk of lung cancer among smokers is 10%, risk of lung cancer among non-exposed or those who are not smoking is 1%, the attributable risk will be 10% minus 1%, which is 9%. We move on to one of the final topics of discussion, which is association and causation. So of course we can make these comparisons and we can draw some associations. For instance, if I tell you that maternal deaths are associated with hospital deliveries, because a study has shown that a lady is more, the number of deaths occurring among the number of women who are delivering in hospital is more. For example, if 100 women are delivering in hospital, 20 of them are dying. But if 100 deliveries are occurring at homes, in their respective homes, only 10 women are dying. Can we say that hospital deliveries are associated with maternal deaths? That if you observe more keenly, you will realize it is not necessarily the case, because there are certain differences in characteristics of those who are going to hospitals. It might be possible that those who are visiting hospitals are actually serious, and therefore their likelihood of dying is actually more. Whereas those who are actually deciding to deliver at home might all be normal delivery cases, and therefore their chance of death is actually less. So the comparison to be made between both these groups is actually a wrong comparison, because the characteristics of both these groups is actually different. So in this case, we cannot say that hospital deliveries is associated with maternal deaths, though it appears to be so. In another situation, when we conduct a survey, we might find that the number of cases of lung cancer, for instance, is higher among those of lower socioeconomic status. So we have found in our survey that the number of lung cancers is higher among those with lower socioeconomic status. So we say that there is an association between lower socioeconomic status and lung cancer. But can we say that the lower socioeconomic status is actually causing the lung cancer? That we cannot say on the basis of this particular survey, though there is an association. So there is a difference between association or finding an association from a particular study and causation. There are certain methods by which we can further inquire into the causal association between a particular exposure or intervention and an outcome. These criteria were first proposed by Bradford Hill in 1965. Here there are 9 factors that are listed which will help us identify whether a particular factor is causally linked to a particular health outcome. The first here is called strength of association. If the strength of association is high, for example, if you have calculated the odds ratio, we have calculated the relative risk, and if we see that the relative risk is very high, there is a good chance that this might be a causal association. Secondly, consistency, meaning to say that different people have conducted the research in different settings and have found the same result. That might give us another clue. Third is specificity of association. Fourth is temporality, meaning to say that the exposure or intervention should have occurred prior to the health outcome. So if we see that somebody has smoked cigarettes and then getting lung cancer, then we can say that there is some you can say weight behind this particular argument. If somebody was exposed to a particular chemical and then is getting some kind of a reaction in the body, then we can say that the temporality clause is satisfied because the exposure is happening prior to the health outcome. So the temporality has to be identified. Next is biological gradient, meaning those who are exposed more to a higher dose of a particular hazard or an intervention, the result seen in that particular group is also more. For example, if we again go back to the risk of lung cancer and smoking, those who are smoking maybe 5 cigarettes a day, they might be having a certain risk of lung cancer. Those who are smoking 10 cigarettes or 20 cigarettes a day, in that group, the risk of lung cancer might be more. And those who are smoking no cigarettes, the risk of lung cancer might be least. So we see something called as a dose response here. The higher the number of cigarettes and the more the number of years of smoking, the higher the risk of lung cancer. So this is called dose and response. Next is plausibility or biological plausibility. If there is a mechanism by which that particular hazard can actually create the particular effect that is being seen, there is a biological plausibility for what kind of outcome that we are observing. For example, if you have understood that mercury is causing brain damage, and we see that when we have tested the brain tissue, the mercury has a certain characteristic by which it is able to damage the brain cells. So that kind of research is helping us identify, even at an epidemiological level, there is some, you can say, weight in the argument that so many people are being affected by mercury at a population level. Coherence with other scientific evidence. For example, if animal studies have shown that exposure to this kind of hazard is creating certain kinds of health effects, that might be relatable to what we are finding at an epidemiological level also. That helps increase the strength of our evidence. Eighth point is experimental evidence. If a randomized controlled trial has been performed and that is giving us a certain kind of result, that is actually increasing the weight of our evidence. And analogy is basically a comparison of this kind of outcome and exposure to a similar kind of outcome and exposure. And if there is some kind of analogous, you can say, relationship, that also adds to the strength of our evidence. One of the final concepts that we are going to discuss is alternative explanations to what we have found as a part of our study. So you have got a particular result for your study. How are you going to interpret it? Is it that what you have found is the truth? Is it the truth? Or could it be one of the following? Is it possible that what you have found is purely because of chance? It might be possible that what you have found is because of chance. And one of the ways in which we address this is by selecting the appropriate sample size and by using statistical tests to check whether what has occurred due to chance or whether there is any truth in what we have found. So the p-value which we have used in our statistical test is actually telling us whether our findings are due to chance or whether the probability of chance is less in this particular result which we have found. The second is called bias. So with statistical tests and the calculation of p-value, we have ruled out the possibility of chance playing a role in the kind of result that we have got. The next alternative explanation for the results that we may have got is bias. Bias is basically a systematic deviation from the truth. There are two types of bias that can creep into any kind of study. One is selection bias and second is measurement bias. By selection bias, we mean the kind of people we are selecting into our study. There might be some problem with the way we have done that selection. So for example, when I told you about the surveys, if we are, for example, conducting a survey on awareness of HIV, how aware are people about the ways in which HIV is spread, and you are asking the population, and there are a group of people who are refusing to answer your particular survey questionnaire. It might be possible that those who are not answering your questions are the ones who are unaware of HIV. Suppose your survey, you find that 50% people are aware of HIV. But it is possible that many people who are actually not aware have not answered your survey. So your result which you have obtained is actually not the truth. And the reason is your survey has not included a section of the population which you should have included. So selection bias comes in this way and in other ways also, and it definitely affects the outcome of your study. Second is measurement bias. There are several types of measurement bias. But for example, if you are using an instrument which is not measuring, the values properly. For example, if you are using a weighing machine which is always showing 2 kgs more for everybody, then it may be possible that the result which you have obtained, though you have done everything properly, but the result that you have obtained is slightly different from what it would have been if the weighing machine is proper. So there is a measurement bias. So in a very basic way, I have introduced selection and measurement bias. There is a lot more details about each of these things and how each study design you can get selection bias and how in each study you can get measurement bias, about which you can read in your module. The third explanation is alternative explanation for what you may have found is called confounding. For example, if you are looking at the relationship between air pollution, and lung cancer, and you have found a particular result, it might be possible that what you have found is primarily related to the way the different groups are smoking rather than are exposed to air pollution. So you have to make sure that the groups you have chosen for your study have either equal number of smokers and non-smokers, or you should be aware of the number of smokers in each of these groups, because smoking is also associated with lung cancer. So when you are trying to study the relationship between air pollution and lung cancer, you also have to take into account the other causes of lung cancer, which is in this case smoking. If you don't take that into account, the analysis which you are going to do for air pollution and lung cancer might not be giving you the actual result of the relationship between air pollution and lung cancer. It might be possible that the population which is exposed to air pollution is also the one which is smoking. So the effect that you are getting is more than what you should be getting. So these are the basic 3 alternative explanations: chance, bias and confounding. And epidemiologists are using study designs and the statistical tests primarily to eliminate these alternative explanations. So a carefully planned and carefully designed study is primarily aiming to minimize chance, to minimize bias, and to take account of all the confounding factors. The last thing that I think is useful to understand when we are talking about epidemiology and biostatistics is how is this discipline different from qualitative research. So this is just a simple slide trying to show the differences between epidemiological research techniques and qualitative research techniques. So the kind of question that you ask will determine whether you will need to use an epidemiological technique or a qualitative research technique for answering that particular question. I'll give you an example here of an epidemiological question and a qualitative questions. So the first question here is, are children who are not breastfed at a greater risk for malnutrition than those who are breastfed? Okay. Here is another question. What are the reasons due to which some mothers in Uttar Pradesh are not breastfeeding their infants? If you look at both these questions, probably you will be able to see there is some difference between both these questions. In the second question, we are saying what are the reasons due to which some mothers in Uttar Pradesh did not breastfeed their infants. In this particular instance, the only thing we can do to find out the answers is to actually sit with the mother and ask her this question. What is the reason you have not breastfed your infant? And then the mother will tell you many reasons why she may not have breastfed her infant. It might be related to her job, it might be related to her some medical problem, it might be related to some cultural practice, it might be related to many things. So the kind of data that we are obtaining from that particular kind of approach is coming in the form of words. So the mother is telling you things and you are going to document it in the form of words. So you are not going to document it in the form of numbers. We are not interested to know here, are 10% of mothers not breastfeeding their children because of a particular problem? Are 20% not breastfeeding because of another problem? We want to know all the reasons because of which mothers are not able to breastfeed their children. So we will talk to many mothers from different socioeconomic strata, mothers who are working, who are not working, mothers who are suffering from particular problems, mothers from different cultural communities. And after speaking to them, we will get a whole list of reasons why a mother may not be able to or choosing not to breastfeed their infants. This kind of research study will require a qualitative approach because we are actually going with questions and not with hypothesis. In qualitative research, we are usually not going in with a preconceived hypothesis. Whereas in the other question, are children who are breastfed at a greater risk for malnutrition than those who are breastfed? We have a clear hypothesis. And our hypothesis here is those who are not breastfed are at a higher risk of malnutrition than those who are breastfed. And we will test it by going and measuring the weight of children who are breastfed, going and measuring the weight of children who are not breastfed, and making a comparison between both these two groups. So that is an epidemiological question and can be answered through epidemiological techniques. But the second question requires qualitative techniques where you will be conducting an in-depth interview with the mothers who are not able to breastfeed their infants, or you will bring a group of mothers together and you will conduct a group interview, or what we call as a focused group discussion with the group of mothers. And this might also help give you data about what are the reasons due to which mothers are not able to breastfeed their infants. So this is the basic difference between qualitative and epidemiological techniques. In the form of the table here, I have shown that in epidemiological research, data is usually coming in the form of numbers, whereas in qualitative research, it is coming in the form of words. Epidemiological research helps us identify disease burden and causes, whereas qualitative research helps us understand about individual and group behaviors and perspectives, which may have an impact on their health and health-seeking behaviors. And in epidemiological research, we are actually testing hypotheses, whereas in qualitative research, we are trying to generate concepts and an understanding about why a certain situation is the way it is. So these are some basic differences between epidemiological and qualitative research. I hope that is clear, because the kind of question you ask will determine whether you will use an epidemiological technique or a qualitative research technique. So with this, we come to the end of the video lecture. I hope you have been able to understand the basics of the various concepts and terms that have been discussed. This is again by no means comprehensive. It is just touched upon all these topics, and it will require a lot of hard work on your part to go through the materials so that you can become clear about these various concepts and how you can apply them. I would recommend that you refer one of two texts and manuals. The first one is called Basic Epidemiology. It has got a lot of information on all the epidemiological techniques and biostatistical techniques. This is a WHO publication which was written by R. Bonita and others. The second manual which I will recommend is called Epidemiology for the Uninitiated, and this is an online manual which is available on the British Medical Journal website. So if you type Epidemiology for the Uninitiated, BMJ, it will give you the link. Similarly, for the previous one, if you type Basic Epidemiology R. Bonita, it will give you the link for the manual. I hope while reading these manuals, you will be able to get a further clarity on these various concepts and topics. If any questions are there, probably we will have another forum during which we can clarify your doubts. But I hope this video lecture has been helpful in inspiring you to read your manual. All the best with studying your manual.